Kia ora and good afternoon, everyone. From those of you from out of town or from overseas, no mai, haere mai. As you've just heard, my topic for this afternoon is about bridging the funding gap, or more specifically, bridging Auckland's transport funding gap. With that in mind, and having just had a conversation with Karen Lyons, there's some of what you'll hear from me this afternoon, which you've probably heard this morning, so my apologies in advance if that's the case, but hopefully the message starts to get through and maybe you start to see also the alignment between central government and Auckland in terms of moving forward. But this afternoon I'll give you my view, or Auckland Transport's view, on the challenges we have in Auckland, some of the thinking that goes behind the solutions for resolving some of those challenges, the funding solution that's been put in place, and lastly, a little bit of thinking about what more could we do in terms of other funding solutions. So let's start by talking about the challenges. So it sounds like you've talked a lot about growth this morning. Auckland is one of the fastest growing cities in Australasia, and the population growth for Auckland over the next 25 years is expected to exceed population growth for the rest of the country. While the population the size of Tauranga has moved into Auckland over the last 3 years, we're expecting Auckland to grow by 55% over the next 25 years. That growth is already putting pressure on the existing transport network and means that we need to support new greenfield housing areas with roads, footpaths, walking and cycling infrastructure and public transport. It also sounds like you've had a conversation this morning about road safety. Well, we have an absolute crisis on our roads in Auckland. As you'll see on the graphic on screen, between 2014 and 2017, the number of deaths and serious injuries on Auckland's roads has grown by 70%. To put that in context, that is far, far more than the rest of the country. And from those of you from across the ditch, on a like-for-like basis, Auckland is performing about 60% worse than Victoria. When you see the impact of the accidents on individuals and families, you know that the situation is unacceptable. When you want to talk about dollars, the cost of road safety is having negative socio-economic impacts to the tune of $1.2 billion a year. That is almost the same as the socio-economic costs of congestion. With so much congestion, it is not hard to understand why, as you can see on the screen, the levels of emissions from road transport exceed 35%. The impact of global warming is being felt acutely, with what was 1 in 100 year events seeming to occur every year. I can tell you from an Auckland transport perspective that our road network and our rail network is constantly being challenged by weather events, and network resilience is a real question that we have to solve. I think Karen talked about congestion this morning, but core to productivity and economic growth is limiting the impact of congestion. For those of you that live in Auckland and travel by car, I'm sure you can attest to the impact that it has on your quality of life. A recent report commissioned by the Board of Directors of Auckland Transport highlighted that Auckland ranks as the 15th worst city in the world for congestion, and peak congestion is worse than comparator cities. The image on your right highlights the level of service that Aucklanders can expect at peak times, with many arterials and state highways offering particularly low levels of service. For the freight industry, where volumes are expected to increase by 68% over the next 10 years, the impact would be severe, with serious congestion extending into the off-peak periods. Lastly, I wouldn't be in government if I didn't talk about value for money. But in Auckland, we're not going to find our way out of these challenges by looking for a silver bullet which involves building new roads or an underground metro to the scale that Sydney has. The cost of land acquisition and the impacts of disruptions on communities means that the way ahead must focus on better use of existing corridors. The situation in terms of value for money, and as you can see on the screen up there, is exacerbated by construction costs which are escalating at a rate much faster than CPI. In short, Auckland as a region is overly dependent upon the private motor car. We have a car addiction with an infrastructure deficit at a time of high population growth. In this context, let's turn to the solution that's been arrived at through ATAP. As Karen would have explained to you this morning, ATAP is a process that was first introduced in 2016. And it focuses on bringing a common view between Wellington, or the agencies in Wellington, and local government in Auckland. It was aimed to stop the agencies talking past each other, arrive at common assumptions, and hopefully arrive at common solutions moving forward. The most recent ATAP refresh was completed in April, and for the first time ever was fully funded with $28 billion allocated to operations, maintenance and capital. Because of the alignment between Government, Council and Auckland Transport, the Regional Land Transport Plan for the Auckland region is wholly consistent with ATAP. In early May, Auckland Transport undertook consultation on the draft Regional Land Transport Plan, and we received a phenomenal 18,000 submissions. What I can tell you is that Aucklanders are overwhelmingly positive about the plan. More than that, they overwhelmingly agree that the priorities that are in ATAP and that are in the regional land transport are right. They want to see investment in public transport and in safety, for example. So what is the strategy, or in terms of the theme for the symposium, the vision behind addressing those challenges? Well, the underlying principles of ATAP are, firstly, that safety of people on the transport network is critical. Secondly, bus, ferry, rail and active modes must contribute more. Thirdly, optimisation, behaviour change and reallocation of the road reserve away from single occupant vehicles, as challenging as that is going to be for some members of our community, is the only way forward. And finally, minimising the environmental impacts of transport is an imperative. The centrepiece of ATAP is the proposed rapid transit network, which includes rail, existing rail, light rail and bus rapid transit. Over the last 15 years, we've seen a significant investment in heavy rail and the Northern Busway in Auckland. That investment has shown us that if we deliver good or great customer experience, that is fast, frequent, rapid services, that Aucklanders will give up their cars for public transport. In fact, 2017 was a watershed year for public transport in Auckland. as for the first time ever, we saw mode share for public transport exceed car use in the peak periods into the centre city. That achievement highlights the need for better transport outcomes across the wider region, and the new rapid transit network will provide better access to get to key centres of employment and education. I'll let you take in the content of the graph on screen for a moment. What I conclude from it is that there is significant investment in public transport, safety, active modes, supporting housing growth and technology. Roads are not forgotten either, although for the most part that investment will be in the period between 2024 and 2028. Of the $28 billion of funding, $20 billion sits within the delivery remit of Auckland Transport. 50% of that funding is for capital and 50% is allocated to OPEX. The scale of the expectations in terms of capital delivery is enormous. To give you an idea, in 2015-16, Auckland Transport capital program was $436 million. Excluding City Rail Link. As you can see in the graph on screen, in 2019-20, that number is more than expected to double to $903 million, and you can see by 2027-28, that number increases to $1.2 billion. Given that I've just spoken about what is genuinely a transformational package which has been agreed between central and local government of $28 billion. The topic that I've been asked to talk about is funding, and I'll now talk about the specific sources of the $28 billion in funding and offer some comments on those funding streams. The latest version of ATAP, or ATAP 2.0, sets out a significant step change in total investment, and without different approaches to funding would have been meant that once again ATAP had a funding gap. By way of example, the previous version of ATAP had a smaller capital program, but nevertheless had a $5.9 billion funding gap. Hence, central and local government have had very much to turn up the volume in terms of thinking on funding to meet a significantly bigger capital program and eliminate the funding gap. I'm pleased to tell you that both parties have stepped up in that regard. In the graph on screen, you can see the composition of the funding mix for the capital program. Central government contributions make up almost 70% of the total funding. Central government's contribution to transport infrastructure in Auckland has increased, and not surprisingly, they are taking a more active role in delivery. Not only is central government investing more, but they're also making it happen earlier. Projects such as Matakana Link Road and support for new housing growth are being fast-tracked through forward funding agreements, which will enable infrastructure to be delivered sooner. Council's funding sources have become more varied in recent times, but historically the tools that they've had available to them have been particularly limited. Unlike the Australian states where payroll tax, stamp duty and land tax are revenue-raising opportunities, councils have been limited to rates, levies, and over the last 15 years or so, development contributions. Development contributions are the main funding tools for growth-related transport infrastructure provided by Auckland Council. They have become particularly important as we try to plan future transport infrastructure, upgrade major arterial roads or public transport corridors, or undertake route protection for the new greenfields property developments. For those of you not familiar with the New Zealand context, development contributions are generally charged as part of the property development. Unfortunately, development contributions do not solve the funding challenge we have in terms of the consequential OPEX associated with provision of public transport services or the maintenance of a bigger roading network. Auckland Council's 2018 long-term plan forecasts about $1 billion of transport funding from development contributions. You will have noted in the graph that the contribution to transport infrastructure that comes from council borrowing is around about 10%. Like revenue raising, Auckland Council was relatively constrained in terms of its ability to raise debt, with a debt to revenue ratio sitting around 260 to 270% over the next 7 years. In the context of the constraints that Council has in terms of revenue raising and debt, regional fuel tax has become an important tool to fund transport in Auckland. As many of you know, it came into effect around 6 weeks ago and levies around 11.5 cents per litre of fuel, including GST in Auckland. From an Auckland perspective, regional fuel tax is an effective tool because the $1.5 billion directly raised through fuel tax becomes $4.5 billion in funding once you add government contributions and development contributions. What most people don't appreciate about the regional fuel tax is that under the legislation it has a life of 10 years and is hypothecated to 14 specific projects or programs. Under the Order in Council, the timing of these projects is also nominated. At a construction industry briefing that Auckland Transport held last week, perhaps the biggest unintended consequence of the regional fuel tax, as I explained it to them, is that it gives them confidence and certainty of what projects will be funded and when they will occur. For us at Auckland Transport, regional fuel tax has another consequence. With every car user in Auckland now paying 11.5 cents per litre, they want to see outcomes. It means that for us at Auckland Transport, we must deliver well and we must deliver at pace. Before I wrap up, I'd just like to talk about some new and potential new options which have implications for the way we fund transport, at least in Auckland and moving forward. Earlier I talked about one of the limitations of development contributions being that they don't address the consequential operational funding requirements. Over the last 12 months, we have been hearing and discussing with a number of parties the possibility of targeted rates. Developers are starting to recognise the issues we face, and in order to make their offering, their housing developments more attractive and ensure transport services are provided, they are starting to indicate a willingness to consider the use of targeted rates for new developments. Not surprisingly, it's a dialogue we're keen to engage in. One of the more surprising developments with respect to targeted rates is in one of the 21 local wards in Auckland, in Rodney. In that case, revenue is being raised out of that local ward and will fund transport services and infrastructure such as new bus services, increased frequency of bus services, new park and ride facilities, and roading and footpath programs. Some of you who are in the private financing industry will be asking yourselves whether there is a role for private financing or PPPs in the funding gap for transport. Well, our plan for Auckland does provide for at least one potential opportunity, the Penlink Roading Project, which is nominated for delivery from 2025. In addition, much has already been said about the potential of a PPP for light rail in Auckland. We are currently looking at other opportunities, but in many cases, the nature of the program, the optimisation of brownfields infrastructure, does not actually lend itself particularly well to PPPs. My presentation today would be incomplete if I did not talk about road congestion charging. I know that is something that Stephen's been advocating for, and it's something collectively central government and local government are working towards. Both have an appetite to fully explore its potential as a travel demand management tool and a funding tool. The topic is complex, and to date we have not seen a model from elsewhere in the world that we can shift and lift. In wrapping up, I'd just like to recap by saying it's a really exciting time for transport in Auckland. There is a plan which has unprecedented support, but it will require Aucklanders to change the way they live and move around the city. There is also funding to support it, and now is the time to crack on with delivery. Thank you.